Creepypastas are a medium I'm sure many are well aware of at this point, the origin of which came from spam emails that circulated around the early 2000s called copypastas. However, some would take on a more horror-based presence, oftentimes encouraging recipients to forward said email to a number of other people or else they would be haunted or killed or whatever. Around the same time, an infamous story called Ted the Caver would be published on the internet. A story cataloging the descent of one Ted and his friends down an old creepy cave. As the story progressed, more disturbing and horrific events would transpire, before ending on a cliffhanger in which the readers would presume Ted is in fact dead. Now, while not being the most terrifying story out there, for the time it was rather effective, and circulation was rampant. This story would end up being sent via email to friends and family alike, in a similar vein to all the scary copypastas beforehand. And while the term creepypasta wouldn't be coined until 2007, in essence, this was the beginning. But you probably already knew all that, or at least a shorthand form of it all. I mean, if you're watching this video, I'm willing to bet you kind of stay within the realm of this type of content. And there's so many of these videos out there, regardless of individual voice, we all end up regurgitating the same facts. Excuse my bluntness, but this video, for the unaware, is actually going to serve as a remake for my third ever video made for this channel. Not counting Top 5 Milks. That video is a year and a half old and it sucks. Don't watch it, seriously. But it was always a video I wanted to re-explore and properly go in depth and discuss. I mean, I grew up reading video game creepypastas in middle school because I was a loser kid who didn't care about anything unless it was centered around video games. Normal creepypastas be damned, but if you slap a little Mario in there, little blood coming out of his eyes, then you have my attention. But let's do it proper this time around. I'll be going over a select number of creepypastas, assessing quality relative to context. Basically, was it good for the time it came out? I will also follow up by analyzing the reception to said work, along with the lasting impact. And hopefully, by the end, I will have effectively demonstrated how video game creepypastas went from scary to stale. The first ever video game creepypasta to appear online, to my understanding, was Pokemon Black. Oftentimes now referred to as Pokemon Creepy Black on the account that Pokemon Black became an actual Pokemon game after the original publication. But it's a simple enough story with the premise of what if you could kill Pokemon and subsequently even the trainers. One of the more surprising things about the story is just how not scary it is, and I mean that as a compliment. The author doesn't really interject with his own emotions or add horror-themed flavor text. The events are presented as matter of fact. It's even all preferenced beforehand that the author loves collecting bootlegs or ROM hacks from pawn shops, Goodwill, and flea markets. It adds an air of believability. The game's not haunted or cursed, it's just a ROM hack or a bootleg of some kind. And the story never tries to present itself as more than just those two things. And because of all this, the story feels kind of real. And I believe that's what hooked many people from the start. This story was originally published on the Nintendo DS blog Tiny Cartridge in June of 2009. Shortly after, articles from Kotaku and Game Informer were written about the story. Clearly, this struck a chord with a lot of people, scratched a specific itch. It showed that, even early on, video game-based creepypastas could work and, in fact, could garner an audience. But with Pokemon Creepy Black reaching and inspiring so many people, it was only a matter of time until those readers sought out to create their own stories that were Pokemon related. Yeah, so early video game creepypastas were pretty much just centered around Pokemon. I guess the nostalgia for these games and how intertwined they are within people's childhood makes them the ideal candidate for horror, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but like, you take a game series that is virtually the same across all entries and yeah, it might be difficult to stand out from one another creatively. Like, let me guess, the Pokemon die in this one. However, the one story that people seem to love, even more than Creepy Black, is Lost Silver. Posted on 4chan almost a full year after Creepy Black, Lost Silver follows a broke college student who couldn't afford the new Gen 2 remakes, so he settles and buys Pokemon Silver from his local GameStop for $10. Those were the days, wasn't it? As you can imagine, the game is scary. It's filled with blood, Pokemon dying, limbs disappearing, and not so cryptic naming conventions. The author, very slowly, deduces that the game must be a ROM hack and some sick person sold it to GameStop, which, 2 points to note there. He's put all this together halfway through the story. Like, plenty of insane shit has happened beforehand. And 2, as a former GameStop employee, when we do trade-ins, we have to ensure the game works before finalizing the transaction. And according to the story, shit starts going down as soon as you turn it on. Those nitpicks aside, Lost Silver is a bit too long of a read. The story is told in past tense, as if the author is recollecting on what happened, and yet the story is told in excruciating detail. Details that really don't add much and ultimately make the story far less believable. Pokemon Creepy Black was nice because it was fast and simple. The author only described the central mechanics of the game and the ending. It's the job of the readers at that point to fill in the blanks. It's effective and it works. Lost Silver, on the other hand, tells you everything. At the end, the author just flat out tells you what the theme of the story was supposed to be, which, hey, I'm glad they did that because otherwise it's not really conveyed well. Which is a shame because I think thematically what they were trying to do was good. Pokemon Creepy Black thematically dealt with death, as in we're all going to die whether we like it or accept it. It's the one thing we can't stop. Lost Silver tries to say that no matter what we achieve in our own lifetime, after our death, eventually the new generations won't even remember us. It's a theme that perfectly parallels the actual story of Pokemon Silver and just Pokemon in general very well. It's just not properly executed. Of course, I'm being rather harsh on this, but for the time, circa June of 2010, this was a hit. It was circulated on the likes of DeviantArt and many other blogs alike. It seems, even this early on, the genre has already taken strides in heading in a bit more of a heightened fantastical approach to storytelling, which was rather inevitable. I may praise Pokemon Creepy Black for being believable, however, if every new story was structured after that mold, then things would be rather vanilla and perhaps a bit dull. But looking back, knowing where this genre is heading, I can't help but wish for at least a couple more stories in that vein. Because on September 7th, 2010, nothing would be the same again once Jujuzable started a thread on 4chan discussing a copy of Majora's Mask he has recently acquired. This story would go on to be called Ben Drowned. Ben Drowned is such an infamous piece of work that it is essentially this new generation's Bloody Mary, or that one story about the guy with a hook for a hand. It lives in such infamy that it has become an instantly recognizable piece of iconography. Or I'm just horribly out of touch with the average person. I think the initial appeal that drew a rather large crowd is the way in which the story was told. At first glance, it's nothing new. It's still told in first person. However, the main difference being that the story wasn't told in one fell swoop and instead was an ongoing story unfolding in real time, as Jujuzable would essentially give updates akin to blog posts. Granted, the story was only told over 5 posts, spanning just slightly over 1 week, but it was still something worth noting because it gave people ample time to speculate and even ask direct questions. However, I think the biggest aspect to Ben Drowned that really hooked people was the fact that there was actually footage. And I should clarify, actual footage provided by the original author. A distinction only worth bringing up because a story like Lost Silver very quickly inspired people to make their own fan recreation games, which through time could be confused with actual footage. My pedantic side tangent aside, this really sold the story for a lot of people. I mean, how could it be fake if there's footage? Well, modding, ROM hacking, and I suppose even some form of GameShark codes, but it was still impressive nonetheless. And for years to come, the creepypastas that took after Ben Drowned, and there are a lot, unfortunately never really adapted the device of incorporating footage, which is probably something I should talk about. The tropes and cliches established in this story. Rereading the story in 2022 is not bad necessarily, but it is one that feels littered with tropes and cliches that plague the genre at large. However, they all originated from this story, more or less. There's some overlapping fundamentals between this and Lost Silver, like the ever-changing names alluding to a larger narrative, and by and large, this is the singularity point that forever guided the trajectory of video game creepypastas. So, what did this story introduce to the budding landscape? For starters, there was an emphasis, or rather a more prominent emphasis, on the narrator's emotional journey. Before, you got glimpses or brief mentions in passing with how the author felt, but in Ben Drowned, every scene doesn't go uncommented on by the author. I both welcome this, and yet, at least personally, I find it a bit detrimental, as oftentimes it's a bit overdramatic and hyperbolic. There's a passage in which the author depicts a scene within the game and it makes him cry, but then when you look at the footage and you watch the scene he's talking about, it's actually really funny, and just the thought of a grown-ass man crying over this just makes it even funnier. But the author reacts to every little thing with these sorts of heightened emotions, so much so that at a certain point, he just kind of becomes a pussy. I guess that's just my inner frat bro coming out, but the main character being scared doesn't mean the story is scary, and at some point, this form of substitution seems to be the intent. Regardless, this is also where the narrative becomes a bit more fantastical by the end. At the start, it still has the whole, oh, this creepy game could be a ROM hack, or something along those lines. Once again, just adding a little air of believability to the story. But Ben drowned? Yeah, it's a full-on ghost by the end. Stating it in such a way that I just did, you'd be right to call it stupid. In actuality, it's built up rather well, and I'm really only okay with such a leap into the fantastical because the footage provided acts as an anchor to reality. The last point to note is the emphasis on the outside world. Beforehand, these types of stories were only concerned within the happenings within the video game itself. Everything else was just set dressing, flavor text. But in Ben Drowned, there's a whole subplot, so to say, involving the old man who solely authored the game in the first place. It didn't get much emphasis, but it was a nice little mystery that kept people speculating. Public reception was good. Who am I kidding? It was more than good, it was huge! However, it still took a couple months for this story to gain traction, but thanks to the actual provided video footage, by the time it did pick up traction, it was a hit. Funnily enough, the story most infamous and widely known is actually one of the first and second arcs out of 3, as this story is actually part of a much larger ARG. You'd be forgiven if this knowledge somehow slipped past you despite the original story's popularity, because while the first 2 arcs were published entirely within the span of 1 year, the third and final arc wouldn't actually begin until roughly 9 years after the last post. Just thought it was worth mentioning before some Melvin in the comments mentions this little fact. But with this story in the public's eye, inspiration would yet again spread. And with that, we enter the great age of video game creepypastas. And yet, it only lasted 1 year before a new piece of work came along and changed the meta for the worst. Yes, I'm talking about Sonic.exe, baby. Now, for posterity's sake, 2 years have passed in between Ben Drowned and Sonic.exe, and the video game creepypasta landscape has changed considerably, as in there's actually a landscape now. Video game creepypastas by 2012 were in full circulation and were seen as a complete subgenre within the medium. The gears were in complete rotation at this point, and I don't mean to gloss over 2011 as if it was some unproductive or uneventful year. The likes of the NES Godzilla creepypasta emerged in that time after all. However, my rather hasteful rush to talk about Sonic.exe is more so brought on due to its cultural impact. In the Mount Rushmore of video game creepypastas, Sonic.exe would definitely be among the collective few. Certainly the next flagship story to discuss, even over the Godzilla one, even though that one came out a year prior chronologically. Also, as far as steering the trajectory of the subgenre, this one probably had the most profound effect. It was one of the first commercially popular pieces of work that masterfully united all the growing and accumulating tropes and cliches into one story. For better, or for... no. It was all for the worst. The timing in which couldn't perpetuate these writing stereotypes any further, as 2012 was the year in which the video game creepypastas gathered a somewhat mainstream appeal. The biggest aiding hand in this instance were the many YouTube videos covering such stories, and at the head of it all was Sonic.exe, which inadvertently went on to mold the landscape in its image. But that's a lot of talk for not even directly discussing the story. So, Sonic.exe, what is it, and why is it bad? In a broad sense, I think most of these video game creepypastas can just boil down to game plus scary shit. So a brief synopsis would just be Sonic plus scary shit. However, that is selling it a bit short. But like many video game creepypastas at the time, this story starts out with the narrator obtaining a somewhat illegitimate copy of the game at hand. Now, it is somewhat important to note that this is written through a first-person narrative, reflecting on the happenings that are set to transpire within the story. Very common and effective framing device for this genre, however, it raises problems near the end of the story. Sit tight, I'll get to it. But what is most apparent, even from the beginning, is the writing quality. Spelling mistakes and poor grammar are peppered in throughout. Even the classics beforehand had these mistakes and were generally excusable. Even in this instance, it's easy to turn a blind eye, even if they're a bit more prominent. However, the true sore spot in this tale really is just its weird sentence structures. Let me just read a quick passage from the start. I looked at the note first and realized it was from my dear friend Kyle. Let's just call him that, whom I haven't heard from in 2 weeks. I know that because I recognized his handwriting, though what was weird is how it looked. It looked badly written and scratchy and somewhat difficult to read, as if Kyle was having a hard time writing it down and did it in a hurry. So not only could this passage be somewhat condensed, but how do you say you recognize your friend's handwriting, but then go on to say it looks completely different? But it's this level of writing that we are dealing with throughout the entire story. If that didn't raise enough concerns, the characterization definitely should. You see, one of the more criticized aspects to these stories was the author's tendency to continue playing the game. If Majora's Mask literally had Jujuzable crying at one point, why would he continue playing the game? Well, there's a somewhat nuanced factor propelling these people to continue these endeavors. Jujuzable was documenting his experience through a series of updates and actually providing footage. He could have quit, he could have put down the controller, but he felt compelled to get the word out despite everything, because there were people out there willing to listen. Once again, it's why the story being told through a series of updates is actually a great framing device. However, in Sonic.exe, there is quite literally no motive to continue playing on, other than contrivance or complete stupidity on the narrator's part. The story begins with the author getting the game and a note from his friend. The note encouraged him not to play it and in fact destroy the game. His reluctance to do so could be perceived initially as the author being naive. However, as the story progresses and the more horrifying events unfold, which might I add had a profound effect on the author, suddenly his characterization of being naive doesn't hold any water, and instead, he's just stupid. This work was posted as a complete story. There's no attempts of framing this as a documentation to warn the masses. So the character motivations don't add up. This is further exemplified by the ending, which we're almost there. So yeah, maybe the characterization is botched and the larger narrative at play here is flawed because of it, but perhaps the actual horror aspects are really effective and legitimately scary. You want to put money on that statement? Okay, so the essence of this story is that Sonic is evil and kills everything. Animals, friends, you name it. This story is covered from wall to wall with blood, as if that is supposed to insinuate some form of terror. Don't get me wrong, blood covering the walls in real life? Horrifying. Blood covering the walls in a 16-bit video game? I mean, I don't think anyone was horrified by playing Mortal Kombat back in the day unless you were a pearl-clutching, Bible-thumping mother. Of course, I recognize that blood and gore juxtaposed to the sunny, bright, happy setting of Sonic the Hedgehog is supposed to be where the horror lies. However, it gets rather redundant and worn out, to the point where any semblance of terror is surely lost. You see, there is essentially 3 sections to this story. I am reluctant to refer to them as a 3-act structure because of how run-on and blurred together everything is. But essentially, you got the Tails segment, the Knuckles segment, and the Robotnik segment. Each segment sees the author playing as the respective character, in which said character will walk through a trail of blood and guts only for Sonic to appear at the end and completely dismantle that character. Rinse and repeat, and you've heard the entire story after the first Tails segment. Also, might I add, at least to my knowledge, this is one of the first stories to describe something as hyper-realistic, a term that would go on to completely be overused within the genre. Now, some may point out that Lost Silver had an emphasis on blood. However, it wasn't as prominent or reliant on such a detail, which brings us to the ending. Before Ben drowned, many of these creepypastas simply ended with the author reinstating that the game they had must have been a hack or a bootleg of some kind, and Sonic.exe starts off with that sort of rhetoric. However, at the end, after Sonic claims he is God, yes really, the PC shuts off, the author turns around, and he sees a Sonic plush with bloodstained eyes sitting on his bed. And that's it. That's it. I'm not joshing. I'm not joking. That's how it ends. I am legitimately not skipping over anything. The ending is as nonsensical and out of left field as it sounds. Also, just not scary either. But also, if this is written as a first-person narrative, and the implication at the end is that the Sonic plush kills the narrator, then how is he able to write this? Unless we are to believe that the author typed all this out right before his death, it doesn't add up, and it's fucking stupid. I'm not a fan of the whole ghost is haunting my game sort of stories, but I can at least recognize that it can work. Once again, Ben drowned, no qualms there, because it's built up slowly, almost like a mystery, and the final revelation made sense contextually because the whole story was designed around that point. But I guess none of these problems actually matter because, as I said before, Sonic.exe was a hit. Much like Lost Silver, a fan-made recreation video game was quickly made and circulated around rather fast. This in turn aided in the story's popularity, proving that a visual aid really does go a long way for publicity. Now, I don't think that I'm completely off base by saying that the general public now do not hold this story in a high regard, although I'm sure there are some people out there still willing to defend this piece. But broadly speaking, and partially through my retrospect, most people can see its many faults. Interestingly enough, Sonic.exe still has a prominent role in many horror circles across the internet. However, I like to point out that this status is more so due to the striking iconography from the original work, and less so the actual quality of said work. Plus, at this point, with so much time that has passed, I'm willing to wager there's a little bit of nostalgia at play here too. But one can certainly question how a story such as this could ever grasp such a large audience in the first place. But it's important to know that hindsight is 2020, and that we live in a very different internet landscape comparatively to the one just 10 years ago. This story entered the scene right around the creepypasta boom of late 2012. The amount of notable video game creepypastas at the time could be counted on two hands. The other component in its popularity is that it's Sonic related. Yeah, so Sonic fans can be pretty diehard, pretty obsessive over their little blue hedgehog, so this story definitely would have grabbed their attention. And this isn't a bad thing or a good thing, it's just a thing. Sonic fans are easy targets to dogpile on, and I don't really have an opinion on them either way, so I'm just gonna avoid any low-hanging fruit. Although, I will play the video of the wheelchair Sonic eating a chili dog.
Chili dog time, yeah.
Other Sonic-related creepypastas would sprout up in its wake, much like the Pokemon creepypastas beforehand, many of which varied in degrees of quality, from bad to shit. An official sequel would come out called Sonic.exe Round 2, which is so unbelievably bad, and for the sake of pacing, I unfortunately can't get into it. But at this point, the floodgates were absolutely open for any video game to be subjected to the realm of creepypastas. And holy shit, were they. Any video game from the late 90s to early 2000s, any video game with a somewhat nostalgic lineage was used as the subject matter for a creepypasta. I mean, for Christ's sake, they got a GoldenEye creepypasta out here. However, following in the footsteps of Sonic.exe and the precedent that story has now set, these new video game creepypastas were more or less all the same. Filled with blood and guts, authors debating over whether or not their sketchy game they acquired is hacked, glitched, or modded, only for the ending to reveal that the actual game in question is haunted. And all of this is topped off with spelling errors, poor grammatical structure, and just bad storytelling in general. It was quite frankly so aggressive with how much low quality content was being pumped out. These events quickly made the creepypasta admins beef up their moderation skills. And before you knew it, almost all the video game creepypastas were forcibly migrated over to the Trollpasta wiki. And yes, that even includes the original Sonic.exe. Were there trolls amongst these creative endeavors? Undoubtedly. The framing device and structure these stories inhabited were very quickly made fun of. However, at the same rate, a majority of these creepypastas were seemingly honest and genuine efforts put forth by the members of the community. Now, admittedly, I set this all up to somewhat insinuate that Sonic.exe was the root cause for all of this, and that Sonic.exe ruined the genre. However, that is a bit accidental on my part. While I do hold the belief that Sonic.exe was the catalyst that started the avalanche, I do also hold the notion that these events were inevitable. If it wasn't Sonic.exe, it would have been something else. The genre was already kind of leaning in that direction anyhow, and to that extent, much like in my analog horror video, you cannot really blame the author, because for them, they just wanted to, and did, create something that they felt so inclined to do. But this was the fate of video game creepypastas. Oversaturation, reliance on tropes, and lack of quality is what led to their downfall. It's what has led to their current reputation. However, there are diamonds in the rough, and I think following in their footsteps would prove beneficial in revitalizing the genre. So let's look at a couple and see what we can take from each one. And the funny thing is, these video game creepypastas aren't based off of any real video games. The theater tells a tale of a long-lost PC game from the early 90s, so shrouded in obscurity that only few people seem to recount the horrors within. The gameplay is described as simplistic, walking through an empty dark cinema theater and occasionally encountering a man dubbed the Ticket Taker. However, as this gameplay loop persists, the more sinister the game appears. It's a short, effective story and it's not real. It's a story of fiction, completely made from the ground up. Without its reliance on being based on a preconceived intellectual property, the story functions in a very similar way to urban legends or myths. A tall tale about a rare, obscure piece of lost media. Not only does it add an element of mystery, but it is far more believable and thus more scary. In return, it's much more creatively freeing than having to work within the confines of certain individual properties. In a similar context, Mr. Mix is another story that follows the same formula of being completely original, and therefore have the same positives. Now, it's important to note that these examples existed BSE, before Sonic.exe, and very few were created in the ASE era, after Sonic.exe. But this does demonstrate that basing a horror story on popular pre-established identities does get more initial attention from the start. The problem being confinement. How many battered and bruised Mario sprites must be described until people stop making Mario-related creepypastas? The answer is that no amount is going to stop these stories from pouring in, and the few out there really trying to elevate the subject matter is going to get buried by the mediocrity. Even my quote-unquote solution faces problems in a similar regard. Mr. Mix and the theater are not all too different, both centered around obscure early 90s computer games with sinister undertones. So in the end of the day, video game creepypastas were always going to struggle when it comes to individuality, as they were always going to ultimately end up the same. They were always going to end up stale. There's only so much one could do with horror centering around video games. There's only so much one could extract from that concept. Its fate always seemed laid out in front. It's just that its popularity and oversaturation made all of its faults appear faster. I know this may sound like a similar conclusion to my analog horror video, but it seems to be a thing with online horror-based content, which may allude to the blame being placed on the people. Too many cooks in the kitchen spoil the broth. However, I do not believe that is the case, and I never want to discourage anyone from creating. Instead, I simply propose that the concept of video game creepypastas was just too tight and strict of a framing device. Besides, I think video game based horror did well for itself in its absence. You see, by 2014, video game creepypastas were essentially dead and were commonly mocked across the web. 2014 and 2015 was effectively the reflective years where collectively people resorted to parody. However, in its place was the indie horror video game scene. Horror-based video games were nothing new. Pretty much since the existence of video games, there were horror games. But by 2014, a little game, I don't know if you heard of it, called Five Nights at Freddy's entered the scene. What was most notable about this, and the games to follow in its footsteps, was its pronounced online presence. These games forced people to speculate and talk amongst themselves. Nothing new, however, the creators would add an extra level of investigation as they would post various cryptic messages across the internet. Messages to decipher, source codes to dig through, and so on and so forth. Now, while this may be very different from video game creepypastas traditionally, I feel like it attracted the same crowd. Long-term investment and speculation mixed with constant updates and clues kind of more or less hit the similar rhythmic story beats presented in video game creepypastas. And while it's not video game related, I also feel as if analog horror or liminal spaces have taken on a very similar role in the recent years, both in regards to widespread popularity and ultimate trajectory. But only time will tell on that last one. So, video game creepypastas went from scary to stale relatively quick. However, many people now look back very fondly on these tales, at least in some part due to nostalgia at this point. Fan art is still very much rampant online, and these stories have never truly died, as it seems the younger generations are getting into them now too, in large part due to this preserved nostalgia people have for them. Which kind of brings me to my final point. Just because something is bad doesn't mean that it's bad. Bad work can still hold a special place in your heart. Bad work can still inspire people. Bad work can still be nostalgic. And bad work can still be liked. And at that point, who really cares if video game creepypastas went from scary to stale? Thanks for watching.